The clash erupted with no warning. In the crowded press room of the Global Security Summit in Geneva, a tense but mostly procedural conference suddenly detonated into a diplomatic free-for-all. Donald Trump, there representing his new conservative coalition, leaned across the table with the force of a wrecking ball, his trademark swagger only slightly tempered by the formal surroundings. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, sharp-eyed and smiling just enough to keep the room from tilting into full chaos, countered with measured jabs. And then there was Raymond Venson. Venson was a wild card, a first-term senator from California whose meteoric rise was fueled by both sharp populist rhetoric and surprisingly moderate policy stances. Rumors swirled that he had personal connections to both Trump's inner circle and Ukraine's top reformers, though no one could pin down exactly how. When he inserted himself into the Trump-Zelensky exchange, he was supposed to smooth things over. Instead, he escalated it into something stranger. "You both know the truth," Venson said, his voice low but amplified by the stillness of the room. "It's not about borders or aid packages anymore. It's about the files." Those 3 words, "about the files," sent an electric shock through the press corps. Trump's expression flickered, his bravado briefly interrupted by something closer to alarm. Zelensky's smile vanished, his hands folding tightly on the table. The moderator tried to redirect the conversation, but it was too late. The exchange had cracked the fragile shell of diplomacy, exposing something raw beneath. What files was Venson talking about? What did Trump and Zelensky know that the rest of the world didn't? By the time the press conference ended, the 3 men left the room through separate doors. None of them answered shouted questions from reporters. But the silence only made the speculation louder. The rumors started within an hour. By evening, social media was ablaze with theories, dissecting every word, every glance, every micro-expression from the summit. Had Venson accidentally exposed a covert deal? Had Trump and Zelensky been secretly coordinating something behind closed doors? Some said the files were proof of illegal arms deals. Others were convinced they were about secret prisoner exchanges, or something darker, maybe even evidence of a larger global cover-up. In the absence of facts, conspiracy theories took on a life of their own. There were whispered claims that the files contained proof of alien technology recovered from Ukrainian soil, a theory too wild to gain mainstream traction but too alluring to die entirely. Another theory, one that spread like wildfire through both American and Ukrainian media, suggested the files contained a list, names of influential officials across the West who had secretly brokered deals to profit from the ongoing war. The idea that Venson had seen the list, and that both Trump and Zelensky knew it, made every denial feel like confirmation. By morning, the rumors had become something much bigger than idle gossip. They were a movement. By dawn, the words, "the files," were trending across continents. The most ambitious conspiracy theorists were already producing slick, half-baked YouTube documentaries splicing together footage from the summit, historical archives, and blurry images of documents that could have been anything from diplomatic memos to old restaurant receipts. Some labeled Venson a hero, a whistleblower exposing a global shadow network. Others painted him as a reckless fool, compromising sensitive intelligence for the sake of a viral moment. In Washington, journalists scrambled to keep up. Every network from CNN to OANN had deployed their top investigative teams, each chasing a different lead. Some dug into Venson's past, hoping to find evidence of ties to intelligence agencies or tech firms known for surveillance contracts. Others were parked outside Trump's Florida compound, hoping for an off-the-cuff rant that might confirm or deny what exactly the files were. At the Washington Ledger, a well-connected political journalist named Emily Cho had barely slept. Her phone had been ringing non-stop with calls from contacts deep inside both the State Department and the Ukrainian embassy. None of them had answers, only panicked guesses. "Some people think it's an old compromat file from 2019. One staffer texted her at 3:47 a.m. Others say it's a new intelligence package, something related to biolabs or secret arms deals. No one knows for sure. But everyone's terrified." For Emily, that was the real story, the fear. No matter which theory people believed, there was a shared sense that something had cracked. Normally, even the most salacious rumors had limits. People understood when they were just chasing phantoms. But this felt different. The silence from all three men, Trump, Zelensky, Venson, was feeding a growing sense of paranoia. The absence of denials, explanations, or clarifications was making everyone's imagination run wild. But it wasn't just the journalists. In a diner outside Cleveland, Ohio, a retired auto worker named Marlene Whitaker sat with her morning coffee, listening to her fellow regulars dissect the news. For Marlene, politics had always been background noise, something that happened far away, affecting people richer and more powerful than her. But this time, it felt personal. "If Trump's hiding something with Ukraine, we deserve to know," said one man at the counter, jabbing his fork into a pile of hash browns. "Hell, maybe that's why our gas prices went nuts last year. Or maybe it's bigger than Ukraine," said another, leaning in conspiratorially. "Remember that blackout at that military base in Poland? They said it was a cyber attack, but what if it was part of this?" Marlene had no answers, but she knew one thing: whatever this was, it wasn't going away. In Kiev, citizens were equally on edge, though their fears took a darker turn. For them, the files represented something far more immediate: betrayal. Social media lit up with posts asking whether Zelensky had been making secret deals behind the backs of his own people. Did these files contain proof that Ukraine's leadership had agreed to concessions with Russia in exchange for untraceable Western funding? Or worse, had Zelensky been planning to sacrifice part of the country in exchange for permanent security guarantees? One Kiev radio host, broadcasting to tens of thousands of listeners, captured the national mood perfectly. "Our people are dying every day, and now we have to wonder if our leaders are selling out our future behind closed doors. We need answers, and we need them now." Even politicians, both American and Ukrainian, were scrambling to adjust to the sudden shift in public mood. On Capitol Hill, allies and enemies of Trump found themselves in an uneasy truce. Democrats wanted to leverage the moment to expose Trump's alleged secret dealings, while pro-Trump Republicans spun the rumors into a new narrative, that Trump was the victim of an international setup, with Venson playing the role of a deep state patsy. For Venson himself, the silence was deafening. His office issued a one-sentence press release. "Senator Venson has no further comment at this time." But behind the scenes, his aides were overwhelmed with calls, from the media, intelligence officials, and even members of his own party, demanding to know what exactly he had meant. The reality was, even Venson wasn't entirely sure anymore. He knew the files existed. He'd seen fragments of them, enough to know they were explosive. But whether they were proof of illegal deals, secret war strategies, or something far bigger, he couldn't say. All he knew was that the world was now chasing ghosts, and those ghosts were getting louder. And somewhere, in the shadows of both Washington and Kiev, the people who really knew the truth were deciding their next move. While the world debated the meaning of the files, a very different conversation was happening out of sight, through encrypted channels, burner phones, and hastily arranged late-night meetings in windowless rooms. In a secure facility just outside Langley, a conference call unfolded with none of the usual posturing. Intelligence officials from the US, Ukraine, and a few select European allies joined the line, voices stripped of titles and pleasantries. No recordings. No transcripts. Only a single shared purpose: containment. "We have two problems," said a voice from the American side. "First, we don't actually know which files Venson was referring to." A bitter chuckle came from the Ukrainian participant, someone high enough in Zelensky's inner circle to speak without fear. "That makes two of us." The truth was simple, and terrifying. There wasn't one set of files. There were dozens. Over the past 2 years, as the war in Ukraine dragged on and alliances shifted, hundreds of classified documents, leaked communiques, and secret agreements had circulated among intelligence agencies. Some were real. Some were fabrications planted by Russian operatives to sow chaos. And some were so sensitive even heads of state didn't know they existed. The problem wasn't just that Venson had referenced files. It was that nobody could be sure which ones he meant. The public believes there's a single smoking gun, said the British voice on the line. That's why this is spreading so fast. They think if they just find the file, everything will be revealed. In reality, no such file existed, or if it did, it was buried under layers of disinformation so thick it was practically invisible. But someone out there knew. Not just which files were real, but which ones could destroy entire governments if exposed. Across the Atlantic, in a dimly lit office in Kiev, an anonymous figure sat alone, a glass of vodka trembling in his hand. His phone, an ancient, untraceable Nokia, buzzed once. A message flickered on the screen. They are looking for you. The man was known only as Vok, the wolf. A ghost in the Ukrainian intelligence world, someone who had existed for decades without ever leaving a paper trail. It was said that Vok had been the custodian of Ukraine's deepest secrets, since the fall of the Soviet Union, entrusted to bury files too dangerous for even the most loyal officials to possess. Vok knew exactly which files Venson had seen. And he knew the senator had only glimpsed a fraction of the truth. The files Venson had stumbled upon weren't just about arms deals, prisoner swaps, or secret NATO guarantees. They were something far older, a story that spanned multiple administrations and at least 3 wars. The files were a record not of events, but of agreements. Quiet pacts between men who were enemies in public but allies when the cameras were off. It was all there. The covert understanding between Russian oligarchs and American energy executives to divide Ukraine's eastern energy fields, brokered years before the first Russian tank crossed the border. The off-the-books payments made to ensure certain politicians, on both sides, stayed quiet about the human trafficking corridors running through occupied territories. The strange, unexplained military artifacts recovered from an abandoned Soviet research facility near Mariupol. Artifacts that had prompted both Russian and NATO intelligence agencies to classify the area indefinitely restricted. The files weren't just a scandal. They were the bones of a story too big for any one nation to tell. And now, thanks to Venson's slip of the tongue, the world was on the scent. In Washington, Senator Venson sat in his office, blinds drawn, phone turned off. His chief of staff stood by the window, watching reporters gather on the sidewalk below like sharks circling a bleeding swimmer. "You have to say something," she said quietly. "The longer you stay silent, the worse it gets." Venson didn't look up. His mind was still replaying those final moments at the summit. The way Trump's smile had faltered, the way Zelensky's fingers had curled into fists under the table. He hadn't meant to say it. It just slipped out. The files. It was supposed to be a veiled warning, a signal to both men that he wasn't bluffing. That he knew things they thought were safely buried. But now, the whole world knew the phrase, and it had taken on a life of its own. Venson's phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "You've started something you can't control. Be careful where you stand when the ground splits open." He deleted the message, but the words clung to him. What terrified Venson most wasn't the attention, the reporters, or the political fallout. It was the realization that, for all his confidence, he didn't actually know the full story either. All he'd seen was the edge of the abyss. And now the whole world was staring into it. By the time the sun set over Washington and Kiev, the files had gone from rumor to rallying cry. In New York, thousands of protesters gathered outside the Ukrainian consulate, chanting slogans that blended outrage and confusion. "Show the files! No more lies! Trump, Zelensky, Venson, tell the truth!" No one knew exactly what they were demanding, but that didn't matter anymore. The ambiguity was the point. The files had become a blank canvas onto which every faction painted their own fears, suspicions, and vendettas. For the American far-right, the files were proof of a secret deep-state conspiracy to control Ukraine and funnel billions into shadow accounts that enriched both parties. For progressive activists, the files confirmed what they'd always suspected, that Trump, Zelensky, and Western oligarchs had been trading human lives for pipelines and military contracts. In Kiev, the mood was darker. Protests erupted in Maidan Square, where banners reading, "No secrets in war," hung over crowds that felt betrayed by both their own government and the West. Rumors that Zelensky had authorized secret territorial concessions to Russia in exchange for covert arms deals fueled the anger. "I fought in Bakhmut," shouted one young veteran into a TV camera, his face twisted with rage. "I lost my leg for this country. If they sold us out, we deserve to know." The Ukrainian government, caught off guard by the speed of the backlash, scrambled to respond. Official spokespeople denied the existence of any secret files, calling the rumors Russian disinformation. But the denials rang hollow. After all, if there were no files, why were Trump, Zelensky, and Venson all refusing to answer the simplest of questions? The rumor had become reality simply because no one could disprove it. In Washington, the fallout was reaching critical mass. Congressional hearings were hastily arranged, with both parties eager to use the files for their own advantage. Republicans accused the Biden administration of burying intelligence that implicated Ukrainian officials in corruption schemes reaching back to the Obama years. Democrats demanded Trump and Venson testify under oath about their knowledge of back-channel agreements made during the chaotic days of Trump's presidency. Venson's phone was a war zone. Every political faction wanted him, some to explain, some to confess, and some to disappear entirely. His once promising career, built on his reputation as a pragmatic centrist, was disintegrating under the weight of a scandal that didn't even have clear shape. The worst calls were the anonymous ones. One came at 2:19 a.m., just as Venson was drifting into uneasy sleep. A voice distorted by digital static whispered, "They were never supposed to see the list. We trusted you to stay quiet." The line went dead before he could respond, but the meaning was clear. Someone believed Venson had seen not just a few stray documents, but the list. The one whispered about in diplomatic back channels for years, the supposed ledger of politicians, military officials, and corporate executives across the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia who had quietly carved up the spoils of the war long before the first shot was fired. The terrifying part was that Venson had only seen fragments, hints of the list's existence, never the full thing. And now the world believed he held it all. The situation spiraled faster than anyone could control. Online influencers churned out hour-by-hour updates, each layering their own spin onto the file's mythos. Some claimed they were proof of alien technology recovered from Ukrainian soil, a pet theory of the far-right fringe. Others said the files were simply a metaphor for the entire corruption-ridden relationship between the West and Ukraine, a story too big and ugly to ever fit in a single dossier. But in the absence of clarity, people filled in the blanks themselves. In Moscow, Russian state media seized on the chaos, blending fact and fiction into a potent disinformation cocktail. Kremlin-backed channels claimed the files proved the U.S. had secretly dictated Ukraine's military strategy for years, pushing Kiev into battles it couldn't win simply to test Western weapons systems in live conditions. The theory caught fire among segments of both the American right and the Ukrainian left, a rare and dangerous overlap. The consequences were immediate. In Lviv, a convoy of Western humanitarian aid trucks was blocked by protesters convinced the supplies were part of the secret deals exposed in the files. In Miami, a Ukrainian expat who had worked for a logistics firm contracted by the Pentagon was assaulted outside a coffee shop by conspiracy theorists who accused her of being a war profiteer. The chaos was self-sustaining now. In the middle of it all, Trump stayed uncharacteristically silent. His campaign staff begged him to address the rumors, to either embrace or debunk them, but the former president refused. "He's waiting," said one aide to a reporter off the record. "He wants to see where this goes before he picks a side." But the waiting game was dangerous, because every minute of silence created space for someone else to control the story. In a dingy Kiev apartment, Volk, the legendary Ukrainian intelligence ghost, watched a live stream of the protests in Maidan Square. His ancient Nokia buzzed again. Another message. "Time to choose. Silence is no longer an option." Volk stared at the screen for a long time before flipping the phone shut. If he released the real files now, they might vindicate Zelensky. Or they might destroy Ukraine's fragile government entirely. If he held them back, the world would tear itself apart chasing phantoms. Either way, his hands were no longer clean. The files had been a myth for years. Now they were more powerful than the truth itself. It was a strange thing, how something as fragile as silence could hold back a flood. For days, Trump, Zelensky, and Venson had all clung to it like a life raft, hoping that if they said nothing long enough, the world would wear itself out chasing ghosts. But ghosts, as it turned out, were patient. By the 5th day after the summit, the files were no longer just rumor. They were gospel to millions. It didn't matter whether they existed as hard evidence or whispered legend, people believed in them because they needed to. They filled a void that official explanations could no longer satisfy. And then, late that night, a single file appeared online. It wasn't a leak from the White House, or a press briefing from Kiev. It came from a darknet Dropbox, uploaded anonymously with no attribution, just a simple label, Piece 1. The file was short, just 3 pages, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that at least part of the conspiracy theories were rooted in something real. It was a memo, unsigned, undated, but stamped with overlapping seals from both American and Ukrainian intelligence. It referenced a contingency framework for managing public perception of unorthodox energy sharing agreements between U.S. private firms and post-war Ukrainian resource companies. In plain English, it was a paper trail connecting Western energy interests to quiet guarantees made at the height of the war, promises that would hand certain oligarchs control over Ukraine's gas fields in exchange for political support and military coordination. It wasn't the whole story, but it was enough to crack the dam. In Kiev, Zelensky convened his top advisors in a cramped, secure bunker beneath the presidential palace. The memo wasn't a complete surprise. He knew those deals existed, though they were supposed to remain buried under layers of shell companies and cutouts. What terrified him was who had leaked it. It wasn't Russia. It wasn't Trump. It was Volk. The wolf had finally picked a side. A grim-faced intelligence chief confirmed what everyone suspected. Volk had been keeping a cache, dozens of documents, all verifying various rumors. The memo was just a warning shot. Unless certain assurances were made, protecting key Ukrainian officials from future prosecution, and ensuring Volk himself could disappear safely, the rest would follow. Zelensky leaned back in his chair, hands steepled beneath his chin. "What happens if the whole cache drops?" he asked quietly. The room was silent. Everyone knew the answer. The Ukrainian government, already stretched to the brink by war, would fracture. Trust in Western support would erode overnight. The illusion that Ukraine was fighting only for freedom, not for corporate contracts and private pipelines, would collapse. And if Ukraine fell, the consequences would spiral far beyond its borders. In Washington, Raymond Venson sat alone in his office, a tumbler of bourbon in his hand, watching the memo flash across every news channel. It was surreal, watching the world tear itself apart over something he had barely understood when he first blurted out the files. A new message appeared on his phone, this time with no encryption, no veil of secrecy. "You started this. Now you decide how it ends." Venson stared at the screen, the meaning sinking in. He could step forward, claim he had seen the files himself, play the hero exposing corruption, even if it meant destroying his own career. Or he could say nothing, let the fragments of truth scatter and let the world piece together whatever story it wanted. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he never thought he'd call. Trump answered on the second ring. "You and me need to talk," Venson said, his voice hoarse. "Before this gets out of control." Trump's voice was surprisingly calm. "Kid, it's already out of control. Question is, do you want to survive it?" On the streets of Kiev, the protests grew angrier. The leaked memo wasn't enough to satisfy anyone, it was just fuel for every faction's worst fears. To the nationalists, it proved Zelensky had sold out Ukrainian sovereignty to Western corporations. To the anti-war left, it confirmed that the war had always been about profits, not principles. And to Russian propagandists, it was the perfect weapon, a story they could twist to show Ukraine as nothing more than a Western puppet state. Volk watched it all unfold from the safety of his anonymous hideout. He'd done what he felt was necessary, reminding those in power that even ghosts could leave footprints. The next step, he knew, wasn't up to him. In Washington, Venson and Trump met in a discreet Georgetown townhouse. No cameras, no aides. Just two men caught in a storm neither of them had meant to start. "Here's the truth," Trump said, leaning forward, his usual bravado stripped away. "There's no single file. No smoking gun. Just layers and layers of deals, half-truths, and secrets too ugly for anyone to say out loud." Venson exhaled. "Then why did you and Zelensky react like you did? You both look scared to death." Trump's eyes darkened. "Because once the story's out there, the truth doesn't matter. It never does. People believe what they want to believe. So what do we do?" Trump smiled faintly. "We make sure they believe what we want them to believe." Venson felt the weight of those words settle over him. It wasn't about exposing the files or denying them anymore. It was about shaping the story before someone else did. And together, two men who barely trusted each other, they began drafting the version of the truth the world would get. In the weeks that followed, a carefully managed narrative emerged. The files were real, but incomplete. A legacy of wartime chaos, misunderstood deals, and hasty decisions made under pressure. The story framed Zelensky as a leader forced to balance impossible choices, Trump as a pragmatist trying to secure American energy interests, and Venson as the accidental whistleblower who had done the right thing, even if it caused temporary chaos. It wasn't the truth. But it was close enough to end the riots. Close enough to calm the markets. Close enough to keep the world from falling off the edge. And the real files, the ones folks still held, stayed buried. For now. The storm had passed. But the cracks it left behind were permanent. And somewhere out there, in a quiet corner of Ukraine, Volk raised a glass to the sky, toasting the only truth that ever really mattered. The files are never the whole story. It's what people do with them that changes the world.